regulations in place to incarcerate you if you violate members of vulnerable populations, for example, if you don't take into account ethical considerations over and above your desire to get observational data. Not just that, but there's social repercussions, right? So don't just think about the judicial repercussions. I mean, this is a huge stigma to have been a participant to or an organizer, an orchestrator of an unethical mode of research. You don't want to be part of that at all, because it's a career ender, it's a life ender. It's better to be and maintain your activities, especially within an educational setting, on the up and up, right? Put everything out there, make sure that you cover all your bases. If things arise that you can't anticipate, you know, indirect third parties are adversely affected by the research. Hey, I stipulated in my introduction that there could be adverse effects of this research on members that I can't even conceptualize right now, and I know that it could, but, you know, it's not going to limit the scope of my findings. The scope of my findings is specifically directed for these populations with these demographic identifiers at this point in time, ... Very specific, right? So, yeah, lots of stuff there. One thing that I want to describe in this, and what I want to show you, is that though I am talking specifically here about qualitative methods research, that these ethical infractions and these ethical concerns arise in all research, biological research especially. So I just want to take a quick sidestep and talk about implications for quantitative research and biological research. I know that after several hours, many hours of this lecture series on qualitative, on ethics and qualitative research, I just want to make sure that I always feel I'd rather the point be so obviously transparent that you get it, rather than at the end of the lecture series, after everything has been concluded, realize, damn, I should have gone back and given them an example outside of the field that I'm discussing so that they understand. So this is what this is. I want to make sure that you have a good understanding. So I'm going to give you an example that doesn't have anything to do with qualitative methods, but it has everything to do with ethics. So we're going to talk about quantitative and biological research. So this is the bottom of page 11. Here are some of the implications. And I'm going to go into more detail on this when I begin in maybe about 4 weeks from now. I'm going to start my, I'm going to do eschatology. I'm not going to do it to its conclusion. I'm going to do eschatology, get to a nice point in the lecture series, and then I'm going to break off and start my medical ethics. And once I start my medical ethics, obviously, it's not associated with either of the two series that I've developed on Qualitative Methods 1, the different forms of qualitative methods research, and Qualitative Methods 2, what I'm doing now, ethics and qualitative methods, irrespective of what form you're using. What I want to do is I still want to maintain a good ethical discourse because, one, I think it's extremely important, and it helps me, it keeps me in conceptually reading ethics. If I stop reading ethics for a number of years, I'll just totally lose touch. So it keeps me, it's like a refresher. For me, it keeps me on my toes with respect to contemporary discourse in ethics. With respect to biological implications and quantitative research implications, I'm going to discuss this in much more detail in that series on medical ethics that I'll be developing at some point in the future. So the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues, and there's a link to the site. Again, I will be further developing a series on biomedical ethics in and of itself. It's, you know, I don't know, 8-10 hours series, whatever. Number one, the growing need to regulate offshore clinical trials. Right? There's a sense in which we have to, again, has nothing to do with qualitative methods, but just to give you an idea of the implications of ethics in general with respect to ethical nature of research, we have to make sure that we regulate offshore trials. Why? Because offshore trials, right, it's the same thing. Here are our participants, but now instead of talking about individuals, we're talking about whole regions or whole nations. What we do is we don't gain consent, right? We don't gain consent, and we run our trials on participants and they don't know the implications of our findings. They don't know how dangerous the research is. They don't know the repercussions of the clinical trials. And, you know, people end up dying. It's a problem. It's a huge problem, right? So there needs to be regulation of offshore trials. And we see exactly why, right? It has the same relationship between a researcher and an individual participant. Insofar as we have this relationship, consent. We recognize part of that consent is itself contingent on disclosure and info and information. It's exactly the same thing. It's just that it's a much larger level, right? You're always able, as far as I'm concerned, to have an understanding of the complexity of a lot of the international stuff if you have a really good understanding of, I don't want to say the simplicity because it trivializes it, but with respect to the international, it is simple. The simplicity of interpersonal, right? So the interpersonal relationship between the researcher and the participant is the framework with which we understand the completely depersonalized relationship between transnational corporations and pharmaceutical companies and potential uninformed participants, right? Same thing. Number two, the coordinated framework, is the title, is an attempt to regulate the, quote, research and development of biotechnology products, right? We want to make sure that the product is itself regulated, right? So that what it is that I'm creating is a product, UCT, and it's a biotech, right? I never have helicopters in there. I don't know what that is. So I'm producing biotech products as a consequence of this research. It might even be the case that I'm using biotech products to do my research. Similarly, as a product, I am creating my findings. I will, at times, use my findings to, as we said, member check with my participant. So you can see the overlay, right? You can see the similarities between the two. It's not a direct one-to-one, but the idea is if you are a qualitative methods researcher, you have, and not just researcher, that's part of it, and you have extensive training in ethics in qualitative methods research, which I wouldn't say that this satisfies as extensive training, but I mean, it's the only training on the internet that I'm aware of, especially to the length that I'm doing. So if you've at least watched the video, 6 hours, 7 hours into the video where we are now, you have an understanding of what's at stake here. It's not just an understanding of what is at stake in terms of qualitative methods research. It's an understanding of what's at stake in terms of the nature of research, period, right? Ethical considerations that govern research and researchers, period, of any kind, right? There's a lot of overlap. So products presenting higher risks or greater uncertainties are subject to higher degrees of oversight, and that's simple, right? Products that have higher risk are subject to higher degrees of oversight. Similarly, populations that we consider at risk, infants, pregnant women, prisoners, what have you, those populations are at higher risk, and there's a higher degree of oversight. You can't gain direct access to members of those populations. The way that you gain access to those populations is typically through a gatekeeper, right? So there is a sense in which there is almost a one-to-one overlay, a one-to-one correlation between what happens in qualitative methods research and what happens at the international level with respect to some of the bioethics and bioethical considerations. I'm not saying it's exactly the same in any sense, but there's a sense in which the nature of ethical research is the nature of ethical research as such, right? Okay. Lastly, before we talk about vulnerable populations and then conclude section 1.5, the implications. The emphasis placed on the regulation of biological research must equally be applied to regulating qualitative research. This is just my own little bit, right? It's important to recognize that biological research takes a lot of precedence. Why? Because it's biological research, right? We want to make sure that our pharmaceutical companies aren't just, pushing dope to people in the third world and then allowing these people to die and assess what's working and what's not. That's sort of obvious, right? We recognize there's a visceral response once and if the population hears of sort of pharmaceutical, clinical, offshore ethical infractions. There's a visceral response from the population at large, and not just the U.S. population, global population. People immediately say, that's wrong, you shouldn't be doing it, I want financial repercussions, compensation, blah, blah, blah. I don't personally, and I've been doing qualitative methods research for a bit, not as long as some of the veterans in my field, but I've had my share of qualitative research exposure. There isn't a sense in which the level of identification of ethical infractions is as simple in terms of an interpersonal violation. It's really hard to identify how power relations are abused in terms of my relationship and access to participants via gatekeeper. How do you identify that the gatekeeper was actually bribed? Unless you have a whistleblower, right? How do you identify the fact that if you are the gatekeeper, that you have coerced individuals and forced them to participate in research unless they disclose that? So it's not like ethical violation, and I hate to put it like this, but this is the truth. This is what I actually believe, right? It's not like ethical violations aren't occurring. They are occurring on a wide scale by researchers. Researchers are committing ethical violations. There's not a question if they're committing ethical violations. They're committing ethical violations. The point is, with respect to qualitative research, it's either because they're noob researchers and they just don't know what they're doing, or they weren't trained properly, or they're, in fact, cooking the books, bending the truth, embellishing, not member checking, forcing member participation, and so on. But that's really, really hard to identify. It's really, really hard to identify that a researcher is, in fact, participating in ethical violations. The point is, though, if a researcher is found to have participated in ethical violations knowingly and willingly, that's the end of your career. Right? It's over. The companies can pay out a couple $1 million, maybe even a couple $1 billion, and rebound after that. If as a researcher, and I'm telling you this as young researchers, don't take the risk. Right? If you've come to this point in your career, if you've come to this point in your life where you're conducting your ABD and you're conducting your field work in order to prepare notes for your dissertation, now's not the time to start risking it. Right? And I'm not saying to be overly cautious, but you would be a fool to get to this point in your career and think that you can go around, I can go around the rules a bit. I'm not quite going to follow the rules. I'm not quite going to deal with the IRB. I'm not quite going to follow the recommendations of my instructors because I think I know something better. I wouldn't gamble on that. I wouldn't gamble on that at all, right? It's important. It's absolutely essential. It's not even important. You have to. You are obligated to make sure that you factor into your research design the ethical concerns for participants. Right? So I just wanted to take a quick aside. I'll go into more discussion on that bioethics concerns in my lecture series on bioethics. I bought the books years ago. I had to repurchase them because I lost them in moving as many times as I've moved on medical ethics. So I have to reread the information myself and get myself sort of affiliated with the literature. But in the next 3-4 weeks, I'll be doing its own independent lecture series on just biomedical ethics and the contemporary implications, which I think are profound. Nothing else to write on the board. I just want to read the last bit on vulnerable protected populations, which was the whole point of discussing gatekeepers. Gatekeepers protect vulnerable populations, protected populations. What does that mean? What does it mean to be a vulnerable population? What does it mean to be a protected population? Better notes design. I probably should have included this before, but hindsight is 20/20. Here's a quote. Quote, "Special considerations apply to protecting the welfare of particular vulnerable populations such as fetuses, children, prisoners, pregnant women, mentally disabled or cognitively impaired persons, terminally ill patients, the elderly, students, employees, and those who have HIV/AIDS. Information either with the general public or with vulnerable populations, or 10 economically or educationally disadvantaged persons. Right? So those are, when we talk about protected populations, we're talking about individuals who meet those criteria. Hopefully this makes sense of more of the complexity, right? More of the complexity of ethical considerations in qualitative research, and making sure that you recognize that you can have ethical infractions during your research in which you weren't a part of the ethical infraction. So you have to make sure that you are up and up, you are by the books. When you're dealing with gatekeepers, the gatekeepers understand specifically how they should conduct themselves in gathering and helping you get access to participants, that you are not going to be subject to any coercion or any force of participants. Participants should not be forced by the gatekeepers. They should not be coerced by the gatekeepers. And when you finally do gain access to your participants, you even have to consider those who are not directly involved in your research, that is, third parties, and third parties who are direct third parties and indirect third parties, and I talked about that. So, I want to thank you for taking the time and spending so many hours with me talking about ethics and qualitative methods research. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Have a good day.